The human brain is an organic perception machine that's learned to filter out information irrelevant to survival over the last 200,000 years or so. Experiments in altered states of consciousness show that inhibiting the brain's self-censoring ability lets us see, as Aldous Huxley wrote, what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. Aldous Huxley was a brilliant author and philosopher, best known, of course, for Brave New World, one of the first modern books to imagine a dystopian future. He also wrote a dozen other novels and hundreds of articles. Huxley was fascinated with altered states of perception and experimented with the psychotropic mescaline in a controlled environment. Now, mescaline's been used for thousands of years by indigenous people all over the world, especially in Peru and Mexico, and it helps them enter an altered state of consciousness. Huxley recorded his trip in the book The Doors of Perception, which I highly recommend, along with Carlos Castaneda's The Teachings of Don Juan series for anyone interested in altered states. Christians might find Huxley and Castaneda interesting because changing our awareness, our state of conscious being, really is Jesus' ultimate goal. During Huxley's trip, he watched as a small vase of flowers began to shine with what he called an inner light. Whereas our mind is normally busy measuring and analyzing things, Huxley reported that during the experiment, time, distance, and space all ceased to exist. He realized that he was living in what he called a perpetual present and became ecstatic when he had a direct experience with what he described as beingness, a blissful state of truly living in the moment and experiencing the allness of the universe. After his experience, Huxley decided that most people, himself included, were living in a very narrow band of perception, and that this narrowness, perhaps we could even call it narrow-mindedness, created a less fulfilling life for everyone. He also acknowledged that drug-induced bliss could only ever be temporary, and so he began devouring the work of Eastern mystics to discover more permanent, safer ways to exist in the bliss state, often called nirvana or even Christ consciousness. I think Jesus attempted to do the same thing, to teach people how to exist in God's bliss state by perceiving reality differently. He did his best to free his followers from narrow-mindedness and instead teach them how to exist permanently in bliss, an open mind of loving understanding that frees us from our narrow-band perception. Such an awakening is what happens when Jesus encounters blind Bartimaeus, we read about in Mark 10, 46 through 52. Jesus and his followers came into Jericho. As Jesus was leaving Jericho, together with his disciples and a sizable crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, Timaeus' son, was sitting beside the road. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was there, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, show me mercy." Many scolded him, telling him to be quiet, but he shouted even louder, "Son of David, show me mercy." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him forward." They called the blind man. "Be encouraged, get up, he's calling you." Throwing his coat to the side, Bartimaeus jumped up and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "Teacher, I want to see." "Teacher, I want to see." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." And at once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. So, our natural tendency when we read the story is to assume that Jesus restored Bartimaeus' physical sight. And while that might be true, I don't think physical sight is the point of the story. Furthermore, reading the story as a physical healing moves the focus to Jesus. Bartimaeus is reduced to a prophetic cog in the mechanics of Mark's rather ham-fisted attempt to reveal Jesus as a messianic fulfillment of prophecy, which Mark fully knew Jesus was not. So, instead, the author invites us to examine this story as a spiritual parable. Reading the tale spiritually, we see that the main character is Bartimaeus, who represents the present state of humanity living in a narrow band of reality with limited perception, but entirely capable of awakening. Remember, Bartimaeus' parable is a small segment of a book about spirituality. So this is not a story about a blind man suddenly seeing Jesus standing before him as a bewildered crowd looks on. Rather, this is a story about perception and how a Jesus-like discernment awakens us to a new reality, an entirely new way of existing together. Once I was blind, but now I see. Jesus begs his followers not merely to think differently, but to perceive a new reality. He urges this because he's operating with a more complete understanding of reality, which turns out to be tenuous at best. Still, Jesus sees beyond this materially distracted world into a dimension more attuned to oneness. I think for Jesus, healing meant changing one's perception of the world and everyone inhabiting it, from the externalized objectification permitting complete domination and destruction of the land and her people, to a radically inclusive love. Our task as followers of Christ is to look through the outer appearance of a world gone mad into the loving core of God, that exists deep within, revealing that there is nothing but God. For thousands of years, humans have used psychedelics to achieve altered states of reality and perceive the world of inner light that Jesus envisioned, even if that only lasts for a fleeting moment. And what modern sojourners like Huxley realized, and what the story of blind Bartimaeus is trying to convey, is that opening the doors of perception leads to a complete change in consciousness, which effectively recreates our entire being. Jesus taught that such a change is not only possible, but that we are born for it. Personally, I find it helpful to remember our interconnection by looking at the night sky, seeing the trillions and trillions of stars comprising our Milky Way galaxy. I often experience the Milky Way and billions of other galaxies entirely within me. That experience of unity with the cosmos is the way of Jesus. It's an expansion of our perception, so we see everyone and everything as part and parcel of God's being, of our being. Even if we can only intellectualize the concept for the moment, it changes our activity in the world. Like Bartimaeus, the scales fall from our minds, and we not only see, we perceive. Amen. Our question to consider today is, how do you practice changing your perception? And this can be you personally or the overall all-inclusive you as well. But how do you practice changing your perception?